Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world in 1918. The guns have finally gone quiet. The last cannon smoke is drifting away. Men are stepping off trains and ships thin, scarred, and older than they should be. Crowds cheer in the streets, church bells ring, and newspapers shout the same word in giant letters: peace. But here's the strange part: if you could stand in those streets and listen closely, beneath the cheering you'd hear something else. Not relief, not joy, a different sound entirely. A soft trembling in the air, like a house that's been shaken by a storm and hasn't quite settled back onto its foundation. It's because the war ended, but the world it shattered didn't magically heal. The year is 1918, and Europe looks like a giant that survived a brutal fight, but can't stop swaying. Entire landscapes are shredded. Villages are flattened into mud. Fields that once grew wheat are now pitted with craters and tangled with barbed wire. The lines of trenches stretch for miles like open scars across the earth. And the people are exhausted in a way that goes deeper than sleep. A whole generation has watched friends disappear into smoke, gas, and machine gun fire. Millions are dead. Millions more are alive but changed forever. Some return without limbs. Some return without voices. Some return with their bodies intact but their minds still trapped in the thunder of battle. Peace in that moment feels less like a sunrise and more like a fragile hush after a violent argument. When everyone in the room is pretending it's over, but nobody trusts the calm. As the soldiers come home, they don't step back into the world they left. They step into something unfamiliar. Empires that stood for centuries have collapsed in just 4 years. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a sprawling patchwork of cultures and crowns, is breaking apart into new nations. The Ottoman Empire, ancient, proud, has fallen, leaving a vacuum across the Middle East. The Russian Empire has exploded into revolution, trading a czar's throne for a fierce new ideology that frightens its neighbors. It's as if the war didn't just kill people, it rearranged the map of reality. In Paris, London, Berlin, Vienna, and villages too small to appear on a map, the same question sits at every table: what now? The leaders of the victorious nations gather to answer that question, and they do it in grand halls filled with chandeliers and polished wood. They talk about borders, reparations, and blame. They talk about how to keep this from ever happening again. Their pens scratch across paper, designing what they believe will be a lasting peace. But outside those halls, peace doesn't feel designed. It feels uncertain. In Germany, the war ends not in triumph but in collapse. The Kaiser steps down. A republic replaces the monarchy. Streets fill with protests, hunger, and anger. The economy wobbles like a wounded animal. Many Germans are not just defeated, they are stunned. They were told they were fighting for survival, for honor, for victory. Now they are told they lost. In France, victory feels like grief wearing a medal. Nearly every family has lost someone. Whole towns are missing their young men. There is celebration, yes, but also a hardening, a determination that Germany must never rise again. In Britain, the empire has survived, but the cost has been monstrous. The public is tired of sacrifice. Parents who buried sons don't want to hear any more speeches about glory. Across the Atlantic, the United States steps onto the world stage as a fresh giant, powerful, mostly untouched at home, and suddenly central to the future of Europe. For many Americans, the war was a chapter. For Europeans, it was the end of a world. And then comes a quiet twist in the story, one that many people won't see clearly until years later. The war may have ended on paper in 1918, but for millions of people, it hadn't ended inside their hearts. They carried it home. They carried it into politics, into newspapers, into schools, into workplace conversations. The war became a ghost that lived in the background of everyday life. Some men returned believing they had fought for nothing. Others returned believing they were betrayed. In Germany especially, a poisonous rumor begins to spread, whispered first in bars, then in political circles, then shouted in rallies. It's the idea that Germany didn't truly lose on the battlefield, but was stabbed in the back by enemies at home. This lie feels comforting to people who can't accept defeat. It gives their pain a target. It tells them their suffering had meaning and someone must pay for it. And so even in the first year of peace, a seed of future conflict is being planted, softly, quietly, almost invisibly. Meanwhile, across the shattered continent, a new emotion rises. Fear. Not fear of bullets this time, but fear of instability. Fear of hunger. Fear of revolution. Fear that the entire social order could fall apart the way empires did. Factories struggle to restart, jobs vanish, governments feel weak and temporary, veterans form groups, some of them peaceful, some of them armored in bitterness, strikes break out, street fights follow. In many places, people start to wonder if democracy is too slow, too fragile, too unsure for a world this broken. After all, it wasn't a debate that ended the war, it was force. This is the quiet contradiction of 1919. The world is begging for peace, but it's also losing faith in the systems that might protect it. Even the phrase, the war to end all wars, floats through newspapers like a prayer. But prayers don't erase memories and they don't refill empty stomachs. The children who grow up in these years learn a strange lesson. They learn that civilization, which adults once said was solid and permanent, can collapse overnight. They learn that borders can dissolve, money can become worthless, governments can fall. They learn that war is not impossible. And as the years drift forward, that lesson doesn't fade, it sharpens. Yet in 1919, in this first soft chapter after the storm, most people aren't predicting another global war. They're simply trying to breathe, trying to rebuild houses, families, and routines, trying to believe that the nightmare truly ended. In bedrooms lit by dim lamps, parents try to smile for their children. In cafes, men talk in low voices about what they saw. In churches, communities pray for stability. But the world is already changing under their feet. New nations are being born with old grudges tucked into their foundations. Old powers are shrinking, new powers are rising. The balance is shifting and no one is quite sure where it will settle. So the peace of 1918-1919 is not a clean ending. It's a pause, a breath taken by a tired planet. Or a hush after thunder. And if you listen to that hush carefully, you can hear both hope and warning inside it. Hope because people genuinely want a better world. Warning because the world they're building is still made of the same human emotions that caused the last one to burn: pride, fear, resentment, and ambition. That's how World War I ends, not with the world healed, but with the world rearranged. And as we let this first chapter settle in the quiet, remember this feeling. Peace is not the same as safety. Silence is not the same as harmony. Sometimes the most important part of history is not when the guns fire, but when they stop, and the world decides what kind of future to build in the silence. Picture a long, polished table in a bright palace hall. Outside, Paris is celebrating victory, but inside this room the mood is different: tight, cold, almost surgical. Men in dark suits lean over maps like they're leaning over a patient on an operating table. Their pens are scalpels. Their signatures will be stitches. Now here's the unsettling thought. In 1919, these men truly believe they are building peace. They are not plotting another war. They are trying to end war forever. And yet, in that same moment, they unknowingly lay down the first stones of the road to World War II. The Treaty of Versailles begins as a promise. After the nightmare of World War I, the victors want to make sure it never happens again. France wants safety more than anything because France was the battlefield. Towns burned there, fields were cratered there, families were buried there. To French eyes, Germany is not just a defeated enemy, it is a threat that must be permanently tamed. Britain wants stability. It wants a balance of power that won't drag Europe into chaos again. And the United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, arrives with a vision that almost sounds like a hymn. A fair peace, a new global order, a League of Nations to solve disputes before they become wars. Three allies, three different kinds of fear, sitting at the same table. Germany, though, is not at that table. That's the first quiet crack most people miss. When the war ends, Germany expects negotiations, but Versailles is not a negotiation, it is a verdict. German delegates are called in only at the end, handed the document, and told to sign. They are not invited to rewrite it. They are not treated as partners in peace. They are treated as the cause of the disaster. Imagine the psychological weight of that. You are a nation shattered by war, starving, politically unstable, and you're being told in the same breath that you alone are guilty and you must pay. The treaty takes German land. Alsace-Lorraine is returned to France. Other regions are handed to Poland, Denmark, Belgium, Lithuania. The Saar coal basin is placed under League control, its coal shipped to France. The Rhineland is demilitarized, a buffer zone with foreign troops watching over it. On paper, these are strategic safety measures. In German homes, they feel like pieces of the body being cut away. The army is slashed to 100,000 men, tiny for a country once fielding millions. Germany is forbidden from having tanks, heavy artillery, military aircraft, submarines. Even the navy is reduced to little more than a guard dog. Again, from one angle it makes sense. The victors think if Germany cannot arm itself, it cannot wage war. But from another angle, the message is brutal. You are not trusted to defend yourself. You are not a full nation anymore. You will be watched. Then comes the part that cuts deepest, the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. It states that Germany and its allies accept responsibility for causing the war. This clause is short, legalistic, seemingly just a sentence in a huge document, but symbolically it lands like a blow to the face. For ordinary Germans, it's not just blame, it's shame written into law. They read it and ask, how can we be the only guilty ones? Did we not suffer too? Did we not bleed too? Even Germans who hated the old Kaiser's government feel the clause is a lie. It paints the entire nation as a criminal, and it ignores the complex chain of rivalries, alliances, and pressures that led Europe to war. Now stack that guilt on top of reparations. Germany is required to pay vast sums to the Allies to cover war damages. The exact number isn't finalized immediately, which adds to the dread, like being sentenced without knowing your punishment. When the bill comes later, it feels impossible. Factories struggle to reopen, farmers struggle to plant, families are already hungry, and yet the treaty demands payment in gold, goods, and labor. The future becomes a debt before it even arrives. What happens inside a nation when it feels both powerless and humiliated? At first there is shock, then sorrow, and then slowly resentment. A deep, smoldering resentment that doesn't need slogans to survive, it lives inside ordinary people. A veteran returns to a half-empty cupboard and hears that his country must pay. A widow hears that her husband died in a war her nation is now called guilty for starting. A young man sees foreign troops in German towns and feels the sting of occupation even though the war is supposedly over. The treaty doesn't just punish Germany materially, it punishes Germany emotionally. And here's the subtle plot twist hiding inside the treaty's logic. Even some of the victors know it's dangerous. British economist John Maynard Keynes, who is part of the delegation, resigns in protest and warns publicly that the reparations are too harsh, that they will break Germany's economy and poison Europe's future. Others quietly share the doubt. They worry that a peace built on humiliation is not a peace at all. But the momentum is too strong. The war's fresh trauma demands a hard answer. The politicians sign anyway. And another twist follows right behind it, one that feels small in 1919 but later becomes enormous. The United States, despite Wilson's dream of a fair peace and a League of Nations, does not ratify the treaty. The U.S. Senate rejects it, and America steps back from European responsibility. So the treaty is left in the hands of exhausted European powers, France and Britain, who must enforce it alone while also rebuilding their own broken societies. In other words, Versailles is created without a stable guardian. Germany signs the treaty under protest. Crowds in Berlin call it a diktat, a dictated peace. The new German Republic, fragile and young, is forced to accept blame and debt for a war it didn't even start as a democracy. This is a key wound. The Republic becomes associated, in the public mind, not with hope but with surrender. And into that wound, political extremists begin to pour salt. They say the leaders who signed are traitors. They say Germany was stabbed in the back. They say the treaty is not law but humiliation, and humiliation must be avenged. At first, these are fringe voices, but the treaty gives them oxygen. Every hardship becomes proof. Every hungry winter becomes a speech. Every unemployed veteran becomes a recruit. Versailles creates a story Germans live inside for the next 2 decades. We were wronged, we were shamed, we were robbed, we must rise again. That story doesn't automatically cause World War II, but it becomes fertile ground for someone who knows how to exploit anger, fear, and wounded pride. Because a treaty can redraw borders and limit armies, but it cannot erase feelings. Versailles tries to freeze Germany in weakness, but weakness, when paired with humiliation, doesn't stay quiet, it ferments, it looks for a voice. So when you hear the phrase, the treaty that planted revenge, don't imagine a single moment of betrayal. Imagine millions of tiny moments, a father staring at a useless paycheck, a veteran hearing insults in a cafe, a child watching his school talk about guilt, a nation looking at a map with pieces missing. These moments don't explode right away. They burn slow like coals under ashes. And history, in its calmest voice, whispers a lesson here. Punishment may end a war, but only dignity can end the reasons for another one. In 1919, the victors think they have secured the future. But in Germany's quiet streets and bitter homes, a different future is already taking shape. A future fueled not by strategy alone, but by a wounded human heart that refuses to forget being humiliated. And that memory, once awakened, will not sleep easily. Imagine waking up in a city where the war is over, but the morning feels heavier than the nights ever did. The streets are standing again, but the people inside them feel hollow. Shop windows are open, yet nothing inside is certain. And everywhere you go, you hear the same quiet sentence spoken in different languages. We survived, but what are we supposed to live on now? That question hangs over Europe after World War I like fog that refuses to lift. The cannons are silent, yes. The flags of victory are folded away, but peace doesn't arrive with full stomachs or stable paychecks. Peace arrives with invoices. Across the continent, governments are drowning in debt. They borrowed vast sums to fight the war, to pay soldiers, to build weapons, to keep nations alive for one more month, then one more. Now the bills have come due. The money must come from somewhere, and somewhere usually means ordinary people. Factories that once produced shells try to convert back to making furniture, tools, locomotives. But rebuilding isn't a switch you flip. It's a slow, uneven climb. Some cities surge forward, others stall in rubble. Every nation tries to patch itself up at once, but the world economy is tangled like a net thrown across the ocean. If one part tears, the rest trembles. In Germany, the weight is unbearable. Reparations from the Treaty of Versailles strain the nation like chains on a man already staggering. The government keeps printing money to meet obligations, thinking it can stretch paper into survival. But paper collapses under that pressure. Inflation turns into a storm. At first, prices rise gently like a tide. Bread costs more, coal costs more, then the tide becomes a wave. A loaf doubles overnight, then doubles again. Salaries can't keep up. People rush to shops the moment they get paid because by evening their money might be worth half. And then comes the surreal phase, when inflation becomes so wild it feels like reality is cracking. Mothers carry baskets of banknotes to buy eggs. Workers are paid twice a day because evening wages won't buy morning food. Children stack bills like toy blocks because currency has become a joke. It's not just economics, it's psychology. When money dissolves, trust dissolves with it. A person who spent years saving for a home watches that dream evaporate in weeks. A veteran who returned believing sacrifice would lead to stability sees only chaos. A nation that was told peace would be better than war begins to wonder. France and Britain aren't immune. Their currencies strain, their factories struggle. Their war dead leave behind a labor gap and a grief that never leaves the room. Entire towns are missing the men who would have farmed the land or built the bridges. The living are trying to rebuild with half the hands they used to have. Across Eastern Europe, brand new nations are learning how to exist while their borders are still warm from conflict. They want independence, pride, identity, but identity doesn't instantly create wheat or coal or credit. Everything is fragile. For a while, the world limps forward anyway. The early 1920s bring patches of recovery, jazz plays in Paris, nightclubs glow in Berlin. There's a sense, especially among those young enough to want to forget, that maybe life can be bright again. But under that brightness sits another shadowy truth. The recovery is built on borrowed air. Nations borrow from the United States, banks lend to factories, factories hire workers, workers spend money. The whole thing is an engine that runs well as long as fuel never stops. Then the fuel stops. In 1929, on a crisp autumn week in America, the stock market crashes. It begins like a stumble, then turns into a collapse. Shares lose value, fortunes vanish in days, banks panic, investors pull back. And as fear spreads, credit locks up like a frozen river. Here's the twist most people don't expect. The Great Depression doesn't start in Europe, but Europe feels it like a second war. Because Europe's fragile recovery was tied tightly to American loans and trade. When American banks demand repayment, European economies choke. When America reduces imports, European factories lose buyers. Goods pile up unsold. Businesses fail. Workers are fired. The storm crosses the Atlantic without needing a ship. Germany is hit hardest. American loans had propped up its rebuilding. Now those loans are yanked away, factories close in chains of doom. Unemployment rises like a dark tide. Men stand in long lines for soup, hats in hand, eyes lowered. Families burn furniture for heat. Hunger enters homes not as a dramatic moment, but as a slow daily shrinking, smaller meals, thinner coats, colder nights. And hunger changes politics. When your child cries at night because there's no bread, you stop caring about speeches on liberty and balance. When your father cannot find work for 2 years, the word democracy begins to sound like a distant luxury. When a government debates and delays, you don't hear careful leadership. You hear helplessness. So even in countries that didn't lose the war, a dangerous mood spreads. The mood says, maybe freedom is too messy. Maybe debate is too slow. Maybe what we need is someone strong. In Italy, Mussolini has already taken power, promising national pride and order. He tells people the chaos of democracy is weakness, and weakness is humiliation. He makes trains run on time, he says. He makes people feel tall again. In Germany, extremist groups, once laughed at in beer halls, begin to sound serious to starving ears. Their arguments are simple, which is exactly what makes them seductive in a complicated crisis. They say this pain has a cause, this humiliation has enemies, follow us and the world will make sense again. People who would never have listened in stable times now listen because stability is gone. Something else happens too, quietly and dangerously. A generation of young men grows up seeing nothing but failure. Not the failure of one leader or one policy, but of entire systems. They grow up with memories of inflation, unemployment, broken promises. That childhood becomes the map of their future beliefs. And so the Great Depression doesn't just collapse economies, it collapses faith. Faith in banks, faith in governments, faith in the idea that peaceful cooperation can protect ordinary families. When trust breaks on a mass scale, people reach for whatever feels solid. They reach for nationalism. They reach for anger. They reach for leaders who speak in certainties instead of questions. By the early 1930s, Europe feels like a house in winter with too many cracked windows. Cold air keeps getting in. Every nation is trying to seal its own gap, but the structure itself is trembling. The tragedy is that none of this feels like it has to lead to another war. People are not waking up wanting bombs. They are waking up wanting work, wanting dignity, wanting a reason to believe again. But history has a way of taking human desperation and turning it into fuel. Because in a world where money has become ash and cupboards are empty, and the future is a locked door, the loudest voice in the room starts to sound like the only voice that cares. That is the heartbeat of this chapter. Broken economies create broken spirits, and broken spirits are easy to steer. So as this part of the story settles, remember the quiet warning hidden inside it. War doesn't always begin with marching boots. Sometimes it begins with empty pockets, with cold kitchens, with a people slowly losing patience for fragile freedoms. The Great Depression is not the war itself, but it is the night that makes war feel to some like morning. And when morning comes in the next chapter, the world will not be choosing between war and peace the way it once did. It will be choosing between fear and hope. And that choice made in hunger will echo for the rest of the century. The night of hunger we just walked through did not stay quiet. It changed the way people listened, what they were willing to believe, and who they were willing to follow. When roofs leak and cupboards thin out, patience for slow arguments disappears. The old promise of democracy, debate, compromise, gradual repair, starts to feel like a luxury for people who aren't cold. So across Europe in the early 1930s, something subtle but terrifying begins to happen. Crowds stop asking for policies. They start asking for rescue, not a plan, a man, not a coalition, a savior. And the more frightened the public becomes, the more a certain type of leader rises to the surface. Men who speak not in careful paragraphs but in sharp, simple sentences. Men who don't ask their nations to think with them, but to march behind them. This is where history takes a turn that feels almost like thunder after a long silence. Because strongmen didn't rise in calm weather. They rose in the storm, feeding on despair, promising certainty, and offering pride as medicine for humiliation. Italy gets there first. After World War I, Italy feels cheated. It fought on the winning side, but the spoils are small. The economy staggers, unemployment spreads, strikes paralyze cities. Communists and socialists gain ground, frightening landowners, businessmen, and the middle class. For many Italians, it feels like the country is slipping into chaos. Into that chaos walks Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned fierce nationalist. He creates a movement that wears black shirts, carries clubs, and makes violence look like patriotism. His followers attack unions, break up protests, and present themselves as the only force capable of restoring order. Here's the first plot twist of this era. Mussolini doesn't seize power by a glorious military conquest. He is invited into power by people who think they can control him. In 1922, his supporters staged the March on Rome. It looks like a revolution, but the Italian king and political elites, terrified of civil war and communism, decide to hand Mussolini the prime ministership rather than fight him. They believe he will be a temporary strong arm, a tool to stabilize the country. They don't realize tools can turn into masters. Once Mussolini is inside the government, he moves quickly. He crushes opposition, censors the press, turns the state into a theater of loyalty. He presents himself as Il Duce, the leader, the man who will make Italy proud again, disciplined again, feared again. To people tired of strikes and empty promises, his certainty feels like oxygen. His parades, his uniforms, his chants give Italians something they have not felt in years: direction. While Italy is being reshaped into a dictatorship, Germany is sinking deeper into its own crisis. The Depression has gutted jobs. The Treaty of Versailles still burns like a wound. The Weimar government looks fragile, divided, unable to stop the bleeding. In the streets, political violence erupts between communists and nationalists. It feels like the country is at war with itself. And into that atmosphere comes Adolf Hitler. At first, he is not taken seriously. He leads a small extremist party. In 1923, he attempts a coup, the beer hall putsch, and fails. He is arrested. Newspapers mock him. To many leaders, he looks like a loud nobody. But prison becomes his classroom. He writes a manifesto. He studies propaganda. He decides that power won't be taken by a rushed uprising. It will be taken by capturing the public mind first, then the state. Germany's desperation gives him the opening. He speaks in a way that feels simpler than reality, and that simplicity is the trap. He offers enemies to blame: Jews, communists, the November criminals who signed Versailles. He offers a dream of a reborn Germany, a nation rising from humiliation into greatness. And because people are hungry and humiliated, many are ready to listen. Hitler's speeches are not gentle persuasion. They are storms. He doesn't speak like a politician. He speaks like a man who claims to hear destiny. He uses the language of wounds and revenge, turning private suffering into national rage. To someone who has stood in an unemployment line for 2 winters, that rage doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like recognition. Another twist is hiding here too. Hitler learns directly from Mussolini's success. He watches the Italian model closely: how uniforms create unity, how parades create belonging, how violence can be framed as national cleansing, how democratic systems can be used as ladders to kill democracy itself. Mussolini becomes proof that the age of strongmen is possible. By 1930–1932, Hitler's party grows rapidly in elections. The Nazis are not a majority at first, but they become the largest bloc. Germany's political center fractures. Coalition governments collapse one after another. Every failure makes extremist certainty look stronger. People stop voting for the Nazis because they love cruelty. Many vote because they believe no one else can rescue Germany. Despair pushes them toward the loudest promise. Then comes the moment historians often describe simply, but it is one of the most chilling bargains in modern history. In January 1933, President Hindenburg and conservative elites appoint Hitler chancellor. Like the Italian king before them, they believe they can contain him. They see him as useful, someone who can rally the masses while they keep real control. They don't understand that when you hand a man a match in a dry forest, you don't get to decide where he lights it. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire becomes the excuse to crush civil liberties. Communists are arrested, the press is silenced. Opposition parties are harassed and banned. Power centralizes around one man. By 1934, Hitler has dismantled democracy entirely and declared himself Führer. Here is what connects Hitler and Mussolini more than ideology. They are answers to pain framed as pride. They promise the same emotional medicine. You are not weak, you were betrayed. Your suffering has a villain. Your nation is destined for greatness. Follow me and the world will respect you again. For societies battered by loss, debt, and humiliation, that message lands like thunder. Not because it is true, but because it is comforting. It gives a complicated world a simple shape. And it replaces uncertainty with belonging. Flags appear everywhere. Marching songs return. Boys in schools are taught to salute, to obey, to think of themselves as part of a grand national mission. Newspapers stop asking questions and start repeating slogans. Fear becomes discipline. Discipline becomes worship. Yet what looks like order from the outside is something else underneath. It is a nation being tuned like a weapon. By the mid-1930s, Europe is no longer just recovering from crisis. It is reorganizing around confrontation. The strongmen rise not as accidents, but as products of broken spirits looking for solid ground. And this is the quiet warning in Chapter 4. When a society is frightened enough, it may trade freedom for certainty and call that trade salvation. The crowds that cheer these leaders don't believe they are inviting another war. They believe they are escaping chaos. They want pride to replace shame, bread to replace hunger, strength to replace uncertainty. But pride, when built on hatred and revenge, doesn't heal a nation. It sharpens it. So the era of strongmen begins like a promise of rescue. It ends as preparation for conquest. And as this chapter closes, hold onto the chill in that lesson. The loudest voice in a desperate room can sound like hope, right up until it becomes the command that leads everyone back into the fire. Hitler did not take power and then suddenly invent his vision. The vision came first. Power was simply the tool that let him force it onto a nation that was already aching. By the time he becomes Führer, Germany is exhausted from years of humiliation and hunger. The Weimar era feels to many like a decade of being pushed down. Hitler walks into that mood like a man stepping into a current he knows how to ride. He doesn't say, "Germany is broken." He says, "Germany has been wronged." And instead of asking people to accept that pain, he offers them something sweeter and far more dangerous, a path to erase it. His story of Germany is built like a myth with a villain and a destiny. Germany, in his framing, is a wounded giant, noble, powerful, meant to rule but temporarily shackled by enemies. The Treaty of Versailles becomes the chain. The Depression becomes proof of betrayal. The loss of empire becomes a stolen birthright. Every hardship is not a consequence of war or bad policy. It is sabotage done to the German soul. This is not normal politics. It's emotional alchemy. He turns suffering into pride and pride into obedience. He tells Germans that strength is their natural state, that weakness is an insult forced on them by outsiders. He talks about national rebirth the way a preacher talks about salvation. The future he paints is not a future of compromise. It's a future of restoration. Germany returned to what he claims it once was and what he insists it deserves to be. But restoration needs a reason, and reason needs an enemy. So Hitler begins naming villains with surgical clarity. Jews, communists, degenerates, foreign powers, November criminals. Anyone who complicates his story becomes a threat to it. And because his story is built on wounded pride, threats are not debated, threats are eliminated. Here's one of the darkest turns in this chapter. Hitler's unity is not built by bringing people together in truth. It's built by pushing them together in fear. He understands something ancient about crowds. When people are frightened and ashamed, they will cling to any identity that promises purity. So he offers purity. He offers it racially, culturally, spiritually. He gives Germany a mirror that shows only greatness and then points at a target and says, "That is what's smearing it." At first, this happens through words. Speeches, posters, school lessons, radio broadcasts, parades that look almost sacred. The entire country becomes a stage where one message plays on repeat. Germany is rising, and it must rise as one body, one will, one race. Then the words become policy. The regime begins tightening society like a fist. Trade unions are dissolved and replaced with Nazi labor organizations. Political parties are banned, newspapers are brought under control, judges are pressured, teachers are monitored, art is filtered, Books are burned in public squares not because paper is dangerous, but because independent thinking is. There's a subtle twist here that many people forget. Hitler does not rely only on terror at first. He relies on participation. He invites Germans into the project. He makes them feel like builders of a new empire. Youth groups promise belonging, mass rallies promise meaning, neighborhood organizations promise status. People are pulled in through opportunity as much as they are pushed in through fear. The result is a nation being rewired. You can feel it in everyday life. A child learns to salute before he learns to argue. A shopkeeper learns which portraits to hang. A worker learns which jokes to stop telling. The regime doesn't just change laws, it changes what feels safe to say out loud. And while that internal transformation is happening, Hitler keeps sharpening the external dream. He revives the old idea of Lebensraum, living space. It sounds almost harmless, like a discussion of housing, but under it is a brutal claim: Germany is too great to be contained within its post-war borders. Germans deserve land in the East. Slavic peoples are cast as obstacles to destiny. Expansion is framed not as conquest, but as nature's correction. He tells Germans they are not aggressors. They are heirs reclaiming what was stolen. That framing is vital. A nation that sees itself as a victim can be persuaded to do almost anything in the name of justice. So preparation for war begins in increments, never in one shocking leap. First, he rebuilds the military in secret, then in bold daylight. He announces rearmament in 1935, openly violating Versailles. He introduces conscription. Factories that once made civilian cars begin making tanks. Young men are drilled again. The Luftwaffe rises from nothing to a symbol of skybound pride. Europe protests. The League of Nations frowns, but there is no real punishment. And that absence of resistance teaches Hitler the most important lesson he could learn. The world is scared of another war, and fear makes it hesitate. He uses that hesitation like a lockpick. A second twist arrives. Rearmament isn't just about weapons. It's a psychological cure for humiliation. Germany's economy begins to improve because military spending creates jobs. Roads are built, industry hums, unemployment falls. For ordinary Germans, life seems to stabilize under Nazi rule. Many people who don't love the regime still feel relief, and relief can be mistaken for legitimacy. Hitler knows that success builds loyalty faster than any speech. A hungry man who finds work will forgive a lot. A nation that hears the sound of factories again will overlook the moral cost if it thinks the price is survival. Then comes the next step of the dream: testing borders, testing nerve. In 1936, he remilitarizes the Rhineland. It's a gamble. German troops march into the demilitarized zone with orders to retreat if France responds. They are not ready for a major fight. Hitler knows it. His generals know it. But France doesn't respond. Britain doesn't respond. The gamble succeeds. Inside Hitler's mind, this moment is electric. He later admits it was one of the most nerve-wracking risks of his life. If the Allies had intervened, the regime could have cracked. Instead, the lack of resistance becomes a victory that feeds the myth of destiny. In public, he frames it as Germany standing tall again. In private, he learns that boldness works when others are too tired to stop it. The dream accelerates. In 1938, Austria is absorbed into Germany through the Anschluss. Many Austrians cheer. German troops enter to flowers, not gunfire. Hitler stands in Vienna like a conqueror without a battle. Again he says, this is not invasion, this is reunion. Germans joining Germans, history being repaired. Then he turns to the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, claiming Germans there are oppressed. The argument is familiar now: victimhood, rescue, destiny. The Munich Agreement gives him what he wants without war. Europe tells itself it has preserved peace. But peace is not what Hitler is collecting. He is collecting confidence. Each successful step reinforces his core belief: Germany's rise is inevitable and the world will not stop it. His circle grows more radical. The army grows more prepared. The people grow more conditioned to the rhythm of expansion. At this point, the dream of a new empire is no longer abstract. It's becoming muscle memory. And this is the danger of a dream like Hitler's. It is not satisfied by the first victory. It feeds on momentum. Like a fire, it needs fresh fuel, and each conquest becomes the reason for another. By late 1938, the mask that this is about justice and reunion begins to slip. Jews are stripped of rights through the Nuremberg laws. Businesses are boycotted. Families are pushed out of schools, jobs, homes. The cruelty becomes systemic, not accidental. Then comes Kristallnacht, synagogues burned, shops smashed, thousands arrested. The nation is being taught not just to obey, but to hate. And hate, once trained, needs an outlet. It doesn't stay inside borders. So Hitler's dream and his nation's preparation move in lockstep. A myth of destiny. An economy tuned for wars. A society disciplined through fear. An enemy created to justify anything. He is building Germany into a spear and convincing Germans they are simply healing. As this chapter settles, the shape of what's coming becomes clearer. War is no longer a possibility in Hitler's mind. It is the natural next act of his story. The empire he imagines cannot exist without expansion, and expansion cannot happen without breaking the world that stands in the way. The tragedy is that millions of Germans do not feel like they are walking toward war. They feel like they are walking away from humiliation. But a path built on lies doesn't lead where people think. And history, soft but relentless, leaves us with this closing thought. A dream that needs enemies to survive is not a dream of renewal. It is a dream of conquest. And sooner or later, it demands a battlefield big enough to match its hunger. While Europe was being pulled toward the edge by wounded pride and collapsing trust, a second storm was forming far away, quiet at first, then steadily louder. It was not born from Versailles or from the ruins of the Western Front. It was born from a different pressure entirely, the feeling of being boxed in. Japan in the 1920s and early 1930s was a nation that had modernized fast, industrialized fast, and risen fast. In a few decades, it had moved from feudal isolation to steel ships, factories, and a seat among world powers. It had won wars against China and Russia. It had annexed Korea. It had tasted what it meant to be strong in a world that respected strength. But strength brought a new problem, one that could not be solved with speeches or pride alone. Japan was an island empire. Its population was growing. Its cities were expanding. Its factories needed constant fuel. Yet the country had limited coal, limited oil, limited iron, limited farmland. The more Japan industrialized, the more it depended on resources from outside its own shores. And dependence in a hard world feels like danger. So Japan entered the Great Depression with a special kind of fear. When global trade shrank after 1929, Japan's exports collapsed, silk prices fell, factories cut wages, farmers in rural villages sank into debt. Some families were so desperate they sold daughters into service just to survive. The same mood that had risen in Europe began rising in Japan too. The sense that ordinary politics didn't have answers large enough for the crisis. In Tokyo, democratic parties argued about budgets and recovery plans. But in barracks and officer schools, another idea was spreading, an idea that felt simpler than economics and more powerful than debate. The idea was this: Japan must take what it needs. To many military leaders, conquest wasn't glory. It was survival. If Japan didn't secure raw materials, others could strangle it. If Japan waited for fair treatment in world markets, it could be humiliated the way Germany had been. If Japan stayed confined to islands while Western empires controlled Asia's riches, it would remain dependent forever. So in their minds, expansion became a form of national self-defense. They also wrapped this logic in a grander story. They said Japan was destined to lead Asia, to free it from Western colonial rule, to build a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That phrase sounded noble. It carried a dream of Asian unity under Japanese leadership. But it masked a harder reality. Japan would be the master of that sphere, and others would be forced to serve it. The first step toward this new empire came in Manchuria. Manchuria in northeastern China was rich in coal and iron. Its plains were wide. Its railways were strategic. For Japanese planners, it looked like an answer to their resource fears, a place that could feed factories and settle populations. In 1931, a small explosion happened on a railway near Mukden. Japanese officers blamed Chinese saboteurs. Within hours, Japanese troops moved in. The incident was convenient, too convenient. Many historians now agree that elements of the Japanese army staged the blast themselves as a pretext. Here comes the chapter's first quiet twist. Japan's civilian government did not fully plan this invasion. The army on the ground forced it into existence. The military acted first, expecting Tokyo to follow. And Tokyo, weak and frightened of its own army, did follow. Manchuria was occupied swiftly. A puppet state called Manchukuo was created, with China's last emperor set up as a symbolic ruler under Japanese control. To the outside world, Japan said it was stabilizing the region, protecting its interests, acting responsibly. To China, it was theft. To many Japanese citizens burdened by economic suffering, it was proof of strength returning. And to the officers who had pushed it, it was proof of something even more important. The world would not stop them. The League of Nations investigated. It criticized Japan. Japan responded by walking out of the League entirely in 1933. It was a clean break with the old international order. In that moment, Japan signaled that it would no longer accept lectures from powers that had built empires of their own. The world protested softly. No one intervened. That silence mattered. It told Japan's military leaders that boldness would be rewarded, or at least tolerated. And once a nation learns that lesson, expansion begins to feel less like a gamble and more like a habit. Over the next few years, militarism deepened inside Japan. Assassinations and coups by extremist officers shook politics. Civilians learned to step aside. The army and navy gained influence over cabinets and budgets. Criticism was labeled unpatriotic. The press was pressured into loyalty. Children were taught that sacrifice for the emperor was sacred. And all the while, Japan's economic machine was being tuned for a larger reach. If Manchuria was the first bite, China was the feast. Tensions escalated slowly until 1937, when a clash near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing expanded into full-scale war. Japanese forces pushed into Chinese cities with speed and overwhelming firepower. The fighting was brutal. The occupation was brutal. Nowhere did that brutality become clearer than in Nanjing, where atrocities shocked even some who had supported the war. Japan's leaders framed this war as a mission to bring order to China. But their own actions revealed a different truth. The war was a doorway to domination. Here's the second shift in this chapter, the one that changes the scale of everything. Japan underestimated China's resistance. They believed China would collapse quickly. Instead, China fought on fiercely. The war became a grinding drain of men, money, and supplies. What was supposed to solve Japan's resource insecurity began to intensify it. And intensified insecurity pushes empires toward even riskier moves. By the late 1930s, Japan was stuck in a costly war in China, while its appetite for oil, rubber, and metals kept rising. Much of that oil came from the United States and from European colonies in Southeast Asia. The more Japan expanded, the more Western powers feared it. And the more they feared it, the more they tightened economic pressure. Sanctions and embargoes began to appear, especially as news of Japan's actions spread. Each restriction felt to Japan's military like strangulation. Their logic hardened again. If the West would cut off supplies, Japan must seize supply sources directly. This is how conquest fed conquest. It wasn't a sudden decision to fight the West. It was a chain reaction, fear leading to expansion, expansion leading to isolation, isolation leading to more fear. So Japanese planners looked south, toward French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, regions rich in oil and rubber. In their view, these lands were lifelines. In practice, taking them would mean collision with the Western empires that controlled them. Still, they kept moving. They were testing, step by step, how far the world would look away. And for years, the world did look away, because Europe was consumed by Hitler and because memories of the First World War made leaders desperate to avoid another. The result was a dangerous vacuum of enforcement. Japan filled that vacuum with troops. By 1940, Japan formally aligned with Germany and Italy through the tripartite Pact, binding the three militarized powers into a shared challenge to the old order. The world was now watching two fires burn at once, one in Europe, one in Asia, each feeding the other's confidence. As this chapter closes, you can feel the pattern emerging. Japan's hunger for power was not born from identical causes as Germany's dream, but it marched to a similar rhythm. Crisis, right arrow militarism, right arrow expansion, right arrow world hesitation, right arrow bolder expansion. And the quiet truth beneath it is unsettling. Japan did not drift into war by accident. It drifted into a mindset where war looked like the only door left open. In the next chapters, that door will be kicked wide. But here, at this stage, the world still has a chance to see what is happening. An empire convincing itself that conquest is survival and discovering that each conquest creates the need for the next. History speaks softly at the end of this part. It says that scarcity can be real, fear can be real, and yet the choices made in fear can build disasters far larger than the problems they were meant to solve. Japan is moving outward now, certain that expansion will secure its future. But expansion, once started, rarely stops where the planners hope. It keeps asking for more, until the map itself refuses to hold the weight of the dream. Mussolini's Italy did not walk into war because it was dragged there. It marched there with its head high, believing it was chasing greatness. After the misery of the Depression and the bitter feeling of being a victor without reward in World War I, Mussolini offered Italians a powerful replacement for doubt, a national dream painted in gold and marble. He kept returning to one image over and over: the Roman Empire, not the real Rome of complicated history, but a mythic Rome of unstoppable legions and eternal dominance. In his speeches, Rome was not the past. It was a destiny waiting to be reclaimed. Italy, he said, had been reduced, mocked, treated as a lesser power. That insult needed correction. And correction, in his mind, could only be achieved through expansion. By the early 1930s, Mussolini had already transformed Italy into a one-party dictatorship. The press was controlled, opposition was crushed, public life was turned into ritual. Mass rallies, uniforms, youth groups, salutes, everything was designed to make the state feel larger than the individual. He called this unity. In truth, it was obedience with music behind it. But obedience alone doesn't create an empire. An empire needs a stage big enough to prove itself. Mussolini needed a victory abroad to match his promises at home. So he looked south toward Africa, toward a place that had haunted Italian pride for decades: Ethiopia. Italy had tried to conquer Ethiopia once before in the 1890s and had been defeated at Adwa. For Italy, that loss was more than military. It was humiliation. A European power beaten by an African kingdom, something that didn't fit the racial arrogance of the time. Mussolini carried that old wound like a flag. Now he would heal it with conquest. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia. Tanks rolled across desert plains, planes buzzed overhead. Mussolini presented the invasion as a civilizing mission, a return of glory, an empire reborn. Newspapers praised it, radios filled with triumphant slogans. Schoolchildren were taught to see Ethiopia as a rightful prize. But beneath the parade language was a brutal reality. The war was not equal. Italy used modern artillery, aircraft, even chemical weapons like mustard gas. Villages were bombed, civilians were targeted. The conquest was dressed in rhetoric but fueled by violence. Here's the first subtle twist of this chapter. Mussolini's war was meant to prove Italy's strength, but it was also meant to distract Italians from weakness at home. Italy's economy was struggling. The depression had hit hard. The regime needed a spectacle powerful enough to overwrite daily frustration. Ethiopia became that spectacle, war as medicine, expansion as theater. The public was not only encouraged to support it, support became part of being Italian. The crowds cheered as if they had been waiting for this moment their whole lives. The invasion offered more than land. It offered pride in a time when pride was scarce. And so for a while it worked. In 1936, Addis Ababa fell. Mussolini declared victory. He proclaimed a new Italian empire. He stood before microphones like a man who believed history had finally bowed to him. But outside Italy, the world watched this invasion with alarm. The League of Nations condemned Italy. It imposed sanctions. Newspapers in Britain and France criticized the aggression. Diplomats gave speeches about international law, peace, and moral responsibility. Then nothing happened. Sanctions were limited and carefully designed not to hurt Italy too much. Crucial resources like oil were not fully cut off. There was no military intervention, not even a serious threat of one. The world protests softly, but no one truly stops him. This silence was not because leaders approved of Mussolini. It was because they feared another war more than they feared the collapse of peace. Europe was already nervous about Hitler. Governments were fragile. The public at home was traumatized by World War I and determined never to repeat it. So the League, which was supposed to enforce collective security, acted like a tired teacher giving weak warnings to a student who had already decided to fight. Mussolini noticed, every aggressor noticed. Because sanctions without force teach a dangerous lesson, rules exist, but breaking them is survivable. The Ethiopian conquest becomes more than an Italian victory. It becomes a demonstration of global weakness. And that leads to the second subtle twist. The Ethiopia War changes Mussolini's place in the world, pushing him closer to Hitler. At first, Mussolini had been wary of Germany. He had even blocked Hitler's ambitions in Austria earlier in the 1930s. But after Ethiopia, Europe treats Italy like a criminal state. Mussolini feels isolated and insulted. Hitler, meanwhile, praises Italy's boldness. He sees in Mussolini a fellow challenger to the post-Versailles order. The two leaders begin to drift into alignment, not because their nations naturally belong together, but because one act of unchecked aggression reshaped alliances. By 1936, they form the Rome-Berlin axis. Italy's foreign policy tilts toward Germany. The fascist world begins to knit itself into a shared front. Back home in Italy, Mussolini uses Ethiopia as proof that fascism works. He expands militarism deeper into national life. He pushes the idea that Italians are not merely citizens, they are soldiers of destiny. Boys join youth camps where they learn discipline and worship of the state. Public events become rehearsals for obedience. Even architecture is turned into propaganda, wide avenues, grand facades, statues that echo Roman symbolism. Italy is being sculpted to match the empire myth. But the empire myth is hungry. One victory needs another to keep feeling alive. Mussolini becomes addicted to expansion the way a gambler becomes addicted to winning. Ethiopia was supposed to complete the dream. Instead, it inflames it. In 1939, Italy invades Albania, a small conquest almost casual but revealing. Mussolini no longer needs a grand excuse. Expansion has become a reflex. By now, Europe is wobbling dangerously. Hitler has remilitarized the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, taken Czechoslovakia. Japan is deep inside China. The League of Nations looks like a shadow of what it was meant to be. Collective security is fading, replaced by a cynical belief that every nation must protect itself alone. Mussolini sees the world turning into a stage for predators. He doesn't want to be a minor predator. He wants to be equal to Hitler, equal to the greatness he claims from Rome. But Italy, despite its parades and speeches, has limits. Its industry is weaker than Germany's. Its army is not as modern. Its economy cannot sustain endless conquest. The myth is larger than the machine. Still, myths don't stop because reality is inconvenient. They push forward until they hit something hard enough to break them. So Italy continues to march toward the next gamble, the next alliance, the next war that will supposedly seal its glory. As this chapter closes, the warning is sharp and quiet. Mussolini didn't rise because Italians loved war. He rose because Italians were tired of being small, tired of being mocked, tired of suffering without meaning. He offered them meaning in the form of empire. He offered them dignity in the form of dominance. And the world, frightened of conflict, let him take his first steps without consequence. That is how Italy's march toward glory becomes part of the march toward global disaster. Not because Ethiopia alone caused World War II, but because Ethiopia proved that aggression could win, and that international laws could be bent by the will of a man who dared to ignore them. History's closing whisper here is simple. When a strongman's first conquest is met only with soft protest, he hears it not as condemnation but as permission. And permission, in the hands of ambition, never stays small for long. Permission was exactly what the 1930s kept handing out, quietly, reluctantly, but again and again. After Ethiopia, after Manchuria, after each broken promise, the world was left with a disturbing truth it didn't want to face. The system built to prevent another global war was failing in real time. That system had a name that sounded noble enough to stand on its own: the League of Nations. It was born from the ashes of World War I with a simple mission: never again. Never again should one country be allowed to bully a smaller one into submission. Never again should disputes turn into slaughter because no one stepped in early. Never again should the world drift into war while leaders looked away. On paper, the League looked like the future. Nations would gather. Conflicts would be negotiated. Sanctions would be imposed on those who broke the peace. Collective security would mean that an attack on one was treated as an attack on all. But paper promises are only as strong as the hands holding them, and the League's hands were weak from the start. The first weakness was built into its foundation. The United States never joined. The very country that had pushed hardest for the League's creation stepped back from Europe once the treaty was signed. Without America's economic and military weight, the League was already missing a pillar. Its authority was moral, not physical. It could speak, but it could not strike. The second weakness was the way decisions were made. The League required near-unanimous agreement for major actions. That meant any strong nation could stall or block punishment if it didn't want trouble. It was a fire brigade that needed a committee vote before it could turn on the hose. And the third weakness was emotional, the kind you don't see on a charter. Europe was traumatized. Britain and France, its primary enforcers, had no appetite for another war. Their people were still burying memories of trenches. Their economies were still brittle. They wanted peace so badly that they sometimes treated warning signs as annoyances rather than alarms. So the League stood there like a guard at a gate with no weapon, no backup, and no certainty that anyone behind him really wanted him to fight. Its first big test came early, and it failed quietly. In 1931, when Japan seized Manchuria, the League protested and investigated. It issued a report calling the invasion unjustified. That should have been the moment for collective pressure, serious sanctions, unified resolve. Instead, the League debated, Japan walked out, Manchuria stayed occupied. The world learned a lesson. An aggressor could simply leave the table and keep the prize. Not long after, a second test arrived with Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. The League condemned Italy and imposed sanctions, but they were timid, carefully designed not to provoke a wider war. Oil was not embargoed. Key trade routes remained open. Mussolini finished the conquest anyway. The lesson sharpened. Even when the League acted, it acted softly. There's a subtle twist here that often slips past people. The League's failures weren't only because it lacked power. They were also because the major powers themselves were divided inside. Britain wanted to avoid war at almost any cost. France wanted security above all but felt too weak to move without Britain. Smaller nations wanted protection but could not enforce it. So the League, which required unity to work, was trapped in an era when unity was politically impossible. The result was a cycle that turned weakness into an invitation. And every time the League hesitated, dictators saw hesitation as a signal. Every soft response became a rehearsal for the next violation. By the mid-1930s, Hitler was watching these failures like a student watching a teacher lose control of the classroom. He learned that international rules could be violated without consequence if the violator acted fast enough and looked determined enough. So he began testing the paper wall. In 1935, Germany announced rearmament. Versailles forbade it. The League protested. There was no enforcement, no combined military pressure, no real economic punishment. Germany stayed armed. In 1936, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, crossing a boundary meant to protect France. It was a gamble. If France had marched in, Germany's forces were under orders to retreat. Hitler knew it was early, risky, possibly fatal to his regime. But France waited for Britain. Britain hesitated, the League did nothing, the troops stayed. And something changed in Hitler's mind in that moment. He later called it one of the greatest strokes of luck in his career. The gamble succeeded not because Germany was stronger, but because the world was weaker than it looked. That is the psychological collapse of the League. It did not merely fail to stop aggression. It taught aggressors that the world would move backward when they moved forward. A paper wall doesn't just fail to stop a marching army. It convinces the army that nothing solid is in its way. The League's supporters had hoped that after World War I, nations would be held together by a shared memory of horror. But memory fades faster than fear. And in the 1930s, fear took a new shape, not fear of war, but fear of acting first. Leaders in democratic countries worried about their own voters. They worried about the economy. They worried about triggering another global conflict, so they kept choosing delay. Delay felt like peace, but delay was a kind of surrender disguised as caution. Meanwhile, each dictatorship used the League's weakness for propaganda at home. Mussolini mocked it as useless. Japan dismissed it as hypocritical. Hitler portrayed it as a club of victors trying to keep Germany down. Their citizens heard those claims and nodded because the League's inability to respond made the claims look true. That brings us to the second twist of this chapter. Every failure of the League did not only empower dictators abroad, it undermined belief in democracy at home. Ordinary people watched international crises unfold and saw their leaders slow-walk every response. They heard speeches about law but saw no action. They saw treaties violated and borders redrawn while their governments argued. To some citizens, it seemed as if democracy could not defend either them or the world. Dictatorship, in contrast, looked decisive. Dangerous, yes, but decisive. So the League's collapse wasn't just diplomatic. It was emotional. It made strength look like the only language that mattered. By 1938, when Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, the League was almost irrelevant. The crisis was handled outside it, through direct bargaining in Munich. The League was bypassed because everyone already knew it could not hold the line. The institution meant to keep peace had become a spectator of its own failure. And the world paid a price for letting that happen early. Because collective security is like a dam. If you reinforce it at the first crack, the flood is stopped. If you ignore small leaks because fixing them feels stressful, the water builds behind the wall until it bursts, suddenly, violently, and far beyond the scale of the first problem. This is what the 1930s were doing, adding water to a dam already compromised. Japan's expansion in Asia, Mussolini's empire dream, Hitler's rearmament, the Rhineland, Anschluss, Czechoslovakia, each event was a leak. Each leak was treated as isolated, manageable, not worth the risk of confrontation. But aggressors don't think in isolated events. They think in momentum. And momentum grows only when nothing stops it. So peace in the late 1930s becomes something strange. It is not peace built on trust. It is peace built on avoidance. A fragile quiet produced by the hope that if you don't challenge the fire, it won't spread. Yet fires spread precisely when they're left alone. As this chapter closes, the image that remains is simple and cold. The League of Nations was meant to be a shield. In practice, it was a signboard that said, "Do not attack," placed in front of men who had already decided to attack. From far away, the sign looked impressive. Up close, it was only paper. And history's quiet reminder here is this: institutions cannot protect peace if the nations behind them are too frightened to use them. When the guardians hesitate, the ambitious advance. And when the ambitious advance far enough, peace stops being a wall at all. It becomes a rumor people tell themselves while armies move through the dark. By the time the League of Nations had been reduced to a paper wall, Europe wasn't just facing aggressive dictators. It was facing its own memory. The memory of mud-filled trenches, of gas creeping across dawn, of entire towns emptied of suns. That memory sat inside every parliament and every household, whispering the same fear: never again. So when the next crisis arrived, Britain and France didn't respond like nations eager to fight. They responded like nations still bleeding from the last fight. This is the heart of appeasement. Not cowardice in the simple sense, but a desperate hope that history could be steered away from another cliff. It was born from trauma, from political fragility, from economic exhaustion, and from the belief that a reasonable compromise might still tame an unreasonable man. Hitler understood that fear better than anyone. He could hear it in their speeches, see it in their delays, and he built his strategy around it. His new empire wasn't seized in one reckless leap. It was taken in steps that sounded, on the surface, almost correct, or at least not worth another war. Each step came with a story. Each story was designed to make resistance feel like an overreaction. The first major step was Austria. Austria was a small country with deep cultural ties to Germany. Many Austrians spoke German, shared history with Germany, and for some the idea of unity had emotional pull. Hitler used that pull like a lever. He pressured Austria's government, funded Nazi groups inside it, and threatened invasion if Austria resisted. In March 1938, German troops crossed into Austria, but they didn't meet gunfire. They met crowds. There were flowers cheering, the illusion of consent. Photographs from that day show smiling faces and waving arms. To Britain and France, this moment was confusing. They could see a border being erased by force, but they could also see welcoming crowds. Hitler framed it as a reunion, not a conquest, Germans joining Germans. The world watched and hesitated. And deep in London and Paris, a dangerous thought took root. Maybe Hitler was only undoing Versailles. Maybe he wanted dignity, not domination. That thought was appeasement's first doorway. If Hitler's demands were limited to fair corrections, then perhaps the nightmare could still be avoided. But Hitler wasn't correcting a treaty, he was testing a nerve. After Austria, his eyes turned to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a region with a large ethnic German population. He claimed Germans there were oppressed and needed protection. Once again, he used the language of rescue. Once again, he painted himself as a healer of injustice. Britain and France faced a brutal choice. Czechoslovakia was a sovereign nation. France had a treaty obligation to defend it. Yet if they declared war over Sudetenland, millions of their citizens, still haunted by 1914, would ask why they were dying for a faraway border dispute. Hitler understood that pressure perfectly. He raised the stakes slowly, letting fear ripen. In September 1938, Europe held its breath. War seemed near. Mobilization began. People in London practiced blackout drills. Mothers remembered nights in bomb shelters from the last war and feared new ones. So leaders reached for the path that felt least fatal. They met Hitler in Munich. The Munich Conference was not a gathering of equals. It was a negotiation in the shadow of threat. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy sat together. Czechoslovakia was not invited into the room where its fate would be decided. Its map was spread out like a patient under knives. The agreement handed the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise that this was his final territorial demand in Europe. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to Britain holding a sheet of paper and the most famous hope of the century: peace for our time. He wasn't lying, he believed it. He was trying to save a generation from another slaughter. Appeasement had a human face. Chamberlain was not eager for Hitler's victory. He was terrified of war. He believed that if you satisfied the legitimate parts of Hitler's grievance, the illegitimate hunger would shrink. For a brief moment, it felt like it had worked. War didn't break out. Crowds cheered Chamberlain, Europe breathed. But here comes the twist that sits at the center of appeasement's tragedy. Hitler never saw Munich as peace. He saw it as confirmation that Britain and France would fold. To him, the agreement wasn't a promise made between states. It was a victory without blood, proof that threats alone could deliver prizes. It taught him that his opponents were not just cautious, they were paralyzed. And for his generals, Munich carried another lesson. Many of them had feared that a war in 1938 would be risky, even unwinnable. Germany's rearmament was advanced but not complete. If Britain and France had resisted firmly then, the German military might have turned on Hitler. Some officers were already whispering about revolt if he pushed Germany into a premature war. Munich saved him from that internal danger. It strengthened his position at home as much as it expanded his borders abroad. Within months, he broke the promise. In March 1939, he took the rest of Czechoslovakia, not just the German-speaking regions. This wasn't reunion anymore. This was occupation. Tanks rolled into Prague. The state of Czechoslovakia was dismantled. The mask of limited demand fell away. And suddenly appeasement looked different. It no longer resembled wise restraint. It resembled a slow surrender, with each concession feeding a larger appetite. But to understand why appeasement happened, you have to feel the forces pressing on Britain and France at the time. Their militaries were not ready, their economies were strained, their publics were deeply anti-war. Politicians feared not only Hitler but also their own voters. And there was genuine uncertainty. Many leaders still believed Hitler could be contained, that war might be avoided through diplomatic patience. Meanwhile, the world kept repeating a lullaby of denial. Maybe this is all he wants. Maybe this is his last demand. Maybe if we give him this, he will stop. That lullaby was soothing. It allowed people to sleep, but it also allowed Hitler to wake, arm, and advance. Appeasement wasn't just a policy. It was a mood. A civilization trying to convince itself that the storm would pass if it didn't stare straight at the clouds. But storms don't negotiate with hope. They gather strength from avoidance. After Prague fell, Britain and France finally drew a line. They promised to defend Poland if Germany attacked. The tone changed, the patience thinned, the denial cracked. Yet even then, a haunting truth remained. The time to stop Hitler cheaply had already slipped away. The Rhineland had been the warning. Austria had been the warning. Sudetenland had been the warning. Each one had been a chance to halt momentum before it became unstoppable. Appeasement delayed war, but delay came at a hidden cost. It let Germany grow stronger. It let Hitler grow bolder. And it convinced smaller nations that treaties were no longer reliable shields. So this chapter closes on a bitter paradox. Britain and France were trying to avoid catastrophe. They were acting from trauma, from memory, from a sincere desire to spare humanity another inferno. But by giving ground to a man who interpreted ground as weakness, they were feeding the very catastrophe they feared. History's quiet line at the end of appeasement is not cruel, it is sober. Peace cannot be bought from someone who sees every purchase as proof that you will pay again. And when the world keeps telling itself, maybe this is the last demand, it risks waking up to a demand so large that only war can answer it. Appeasement had finally collapsed into clarity. By the spring of 1939, Britain and France no longer trusted Hitler's promises. They had watched him take Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and they understood what his last demand really meant. There would always be another until someone said no. So they drew a line at Poland. Publicly, they pledged to defend Polish independence. Diplomatically, they tried to build a front strong enough to discourage Germany from moving east. The basic logic was simple. If Hitler believed a war would be too big to win, he might hesitate. But Hitler had seen hesitation for years. He had built his empire on it. And now he was preparing to take the greatest risk of all, an invasion of Poland that would almost certainly trigger a European war. For that invasion to work, there was one nightmare he needed to avoid: fighting on two fronts. The memory of World War I still haunted German strategy. Germany had fought France and Britain in the west while Russia pressed from the east. That two-front pressure had helped grind Germany down. Hitler was determined not to repeat it. Yet Poland sat between Germany and the Soviet Union. If Germany attacked Poland and the Soviets attacked Germany in response, Hitler's gamble could collapse before it even began. So in the summer of 1939, Hitler looked toward the last person anyone expected him to look toward: Joseph Stalin. On paper, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were enemies by nature. Hitler's ideology was violently anti-communist. He called Bolshevism a Jewish conspiracy and described the Soviet state as a mortal threat. Stalin, meanwhile, watched fascism rise across Europe and saw it as a predator aimed at the Soviet heartland. Their newspapers were filled with hatred for each other. Their systems were opposites. Their future visions collided. Which is why what happened next stunned the world. In August 1939, German and Soviet diplomats met in secret. The negotiations were swift, cold, and almost surreal. Then, on August 23, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact was signed in Moscow. The announcement hit Europe like an electric shock. For years, people assumed that if war came, Germany and the Soviet Union would be on opposite sides. Many had believed Stalin would stand with Britain and France to block Hitler. Others thought Hitler would never make a deal with communists he had spent his career demonizing. But now the two great ideological enemies were shaking hands under cameras. The surface agreement promised that neither side would attack the other. It promised neutrality if either became involved in war. It spoke the language of peace. Yet the true heart of the pact was hidden in a secret protocol, an invisible blade under a velvet cloak. In that secret protocol, Hitler and Stalin agreed to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split between them. The Baltic states were assigned like chess squares. Finland and parts of Romania were also mapped into future Soviet control. This was not diplomacy between fearful neighbors. This was planning between predators. Here's the first quiet twist of the pact. It wasn't born from friendship or trust. It was born from mutual suspicion and timing. Hitler did not suddenly admire Stalin. Stalin did not suddenly respect Hitler. They were both buying time. Hitler needed a clear eastern flank so he could smash Poland without immediate Soviet interference. Stalin needed time to rebuild his military after purges had weakened it. He looked at Britain and France and saw indecision. He looked at Hitler and saw a man ready to gamble on war whether anyone liked it or not. If conflict was coming anyway, Stalin wanted to control where it began and gain territory as a buffer. So each man shook the other's hand with a knife behind his back. To Hitler, the pact was a green light. It meant Germany could attack Poland without fear of a Soviet strike. It meant the two-front nightmare was solved for at least long enough to win the opening battle. To Stalin, the pact was insulation. He believed he could delay war with Germany while letting Western powers and Hitler bleed each other first. He also gained land without firing a shot that day, a strategic border expansion that pushed the Soviet frontier westward. The world reacted with confusion and dread. Britain and France felt betrayed. Smaller nations in Eastern Europe felt abandoned to darkness. Poland understood immediately that it stood between two giants who had just agreed to meet in the middle of its body. But even in Germany and the Soviet Union, there was quiet disbelief among ordinary people. Nazi propaganda had spent years calling communists monsters. Soviet propaganda had spent years calling fascists monsters. Now both were told that cooperation was necessary. Governments can reshuffle enemies overnight. Citizens can't. Many swallowed the news in silence. Diplomatically, the pact rearranged reality. It removed the last obstacle to Hitler's timetable. The German military was already preparing, tanks were fueled, rail lines were mapped, orders were issued. The question was no longer if, it was when. In the days after the pact, European capitals moved like sleepwalkers toward the cliff. Britain and France kept pleading for Hitler to step back. They warned him that Poland meant war. He listened with no intention of stopping. He had already secured his rear. He believed the West would hesitate again, or if it didn't, he believed Germany could win fast enough to control the terms. Stalin, meanwhile, watched with the stillness of a man who thinks he has outplayed fate. He had bought himself time, territory, and a chance to stand aside while others fought. But beneath that stillness was another hidden twist. The pact made war more likely, not less, because it removed uncertainty from Hitler's mind. Before the pact, Hitler had to wonder about Soviet reaction. Uncertainty can slow an aggressor. It creates risk. The pact dissolved that uncertainty. It turned risk into confidence. It created a moment of shocking calm, like air going still right before lightning strikes. And the calm spread. Across Europe, people tried to go on with daily life while news grew darker. Farmers harvested fields beside borders that were about to ignite. Families took walks in parks while diplomats met in corridors. Radios played music between bulletins that sounded increasingly like eulogies. Then came the spark. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. The assault was fast, coordinated, overwhelming. Planes screamed overhead. Tanks punched through defenses. The tactic later called blitzkrieg unfolded with terrifying speed. Poland fought fiercely, but the imbalance was stark. And 2 weeks later, on September 17, Soviet forces entered Poland from the east, fulfilling the secret pact. The country was carved in two. To the outside world, it was the final proof that Europe had crossed the line irreversibly. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3. World War II had begun. The Nazi-Soviet pact, for all its cold calculation, lasted only as long as it suited both men. It was a bridge built from distrust, and bridges like that don't stand long. But its immediate effect was catastrophic. It allowed the war to start exactly where Hitler wanted, exactly when he wanted, with the West forced to respond and the East temporarily silent. The pact also carried a cruel psychological weight. It showed that ideology could be paused when power demanded it. It showed that small nations could be traded like currency by men who viewed maps as personal property. And it left the world with a haunting, almost unbearable clarity. Peace was no longer protected by promises. It was being dismantled openly by agreements between those who intended to destroy it. So this chapter closes on that strange, chilling calm of late August 1939, a calm that was not peace but preparation. The quiet before chaos. The moment when two enemies shook hands not to prevent war but to make war easier to begin. History's last whisper here is simple and heavy. Sometimes the most dangerous treaty is the one that brings silence, because silence can be the sound of a storm lining up its first strike. The spark we arrived at in the last chapter did not flare by accident. It was lit by design, in full view of a world that had run out of excuses. By late August 1939, the calm in Europe was no longer hope, it was waiting. Waiting for the blow everyone felt coming, because every road of the decade had been quietly funneled toward this moment. On the dawn of September 1, 1939, that waiting ended. German forces crossed into Poland from the west, north, and south. They did not move like the slow armies of 1914. They moved like a storm with a plan. Luftwaffe planes roared overhead, smashing airfields, railways, bridges, and communications before many Polish units could even fully mobilize. Columns of tanks punched through borders, not pausing to take cities patiently but driving deep to fracture the spine of defense. Motorized infantry followed, sealing gaps and surrounding positions. This was not just invasion. It was a new style of war, fast, synchronized, and terrifyingly modern. The Germans called it a lightning war, blitzkrieg. The name wasn't poetic, it was accurate. The speed itself was a weapon. Poland fought back with courage that history sometimes reduces to a footnote. Polish soldiers held river lines, dug into forests, tried to slow columns with rifles and horse-drawn artillery against steel machines. Civilians helped build barricades, carried messages, dug trenches where they could, but the imbalance was brutal. The German attack had been planned for months, rehearsed in maps and war games, fueled by a regime that had rebuilt its military for this exact purpose. Meanwhile, the Polish government waited for what Britain and France had promised: support. Diplomats in Warsaw had been told that if Germany attacked, the West would respond. That promise mattered. It shaped Polish strategy. It shaped Polish hope. And on September 1, as bombs fell and tanks rolled, the question was, will the world react? It was how quickly. Across Europe, leaders understood immediately that this wasn't another Rhineland moment or another Munich bargain. A sovereign nation had been invaded in open defiance of every pledge Hitler had ever made. If the West blinked now, there would be no line left to draw anywhere. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's cabinet met in urgent sessions. The mood was heavy, not frantic. People tend to imagine those rooms as chaos, but the truth is darker. They were rooms filled with men who knew they had already reached the end of the road. The debates weren't about whether to fight. They were about how to frame the unavoidable. In Paris, the French government faced the same reality. France had its own scars, and no nation on earth wanted to relive them. But the invasion of Poland was direct proof that appeasement had failed completely. There was nothing left to negotiate, only to respond. On September 3, 2 days after the invasion began, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The declaration was not met with wild celebration. In Britain, people listened on radios in living rooms and cafes. Some cried quietly, some stared at walls. Some felt a grim relief that the long dread had become something real and definable. The streets did not fill with the kind of cheering that had followed 1918. This was not a war entered with illusions. It was a war entered with a tired understanding that the alternative had vanished. And that is why the Second Global War begins not with surprise but with grim inevitability. The world had watched the pieces arrange themselves for years. The invasion of Poland was simply the moment the board tipped. Yet in the first days after the declarations, something strange happened. Something that feels like a twist even to people who know the broad arc of history. There was no immediate large-scale Western invasion of Germany. Britain and France had declared war, yes, but their armies did not storm across the Rhineland the way many Poles expected. Instead, they mobilized cautiously. They dug in behind the Maginot Line. They prepared slowly, haunted by memories of the last war's slaughter. For a while along much of the Western Front, the war existed mostly on paper and in the air, a phase later called the phony war. To Poland, this was devastating. Polish forces were fighting for survival, expecting Western pressure to divert Germany. But Hitler had secured his Eastern gamble with the Nazi-Soviet Pact. He knew the West would be cautious. And in those opening weeks, Germany was able to focus its full force on Poland. Then the second blow fell. On September 17, Soviet troops crossed Poland's eastern border. The Red Army moved in under the quiet cover of the secret protocol we discussed earlier. Poland was now trapped between two invading powers. The government fled, organized resistance splintered. Within weeks, the country was carved apart. This double invasion carried a kind of moral shock that rippled outward. It wasn't just that Poland had fallen. It was that the entire structure of post-World War I security had collapsed in one brutal month. Treaties meant nothing. Borders meant nothing unless backed by force. The West had declared war too late to save Poland, but too early to stop the war from spreading. Hitler's confidence surged. The invasion had worked exactly as he planned. The West was at war with him, but not yet in motion. Poland was crushed. Germany's armies looked unstoppable. And for ordinary Europeans, the old nightmare returned in a new form. Blackout curtains appeared again, gas masks were distributed, children practiced drills, trains carried soldiers instead of commuters. The routine of peace snapped like a thin branch. Still, the larger world did not fully grasp in those first days how wide this war would become. Many hoped it might remain contained in Europe, perhaps even end quickly in a negotiated settlement once Poland was overwhelmed. That hope was understandable. Humans cling to containment when they cannot bear scale. But containment was already impossible. Because Poland was not just a target, it was a doorway. Europe was now split into two armed camps facing each other with no remaining trust. Germany had tied itself to conquest. Britain and France had tied themselves to resistance. The Soviet Union had taken territory that would reshape its own borders and ambitions. Japan was already deep in China, hungry for more resources and more space. The fires were separate, but they were feeding the same wind. So Poland's invasion did something more than start the war. It woke the world by removing the last illusion that peace could be preserved through delay. People had postponed confrontation for years. Now confrontation was here, whether they were ready or not. And yet, in the quiet of September 1939, there is another sobering truth. The invasion did not feel to most people like the start of an epic saga. It felt like the end of a decade of dread. The sense wasn't of a door opening, but of a ceiling finally collapsing. History is often remembered by its explosions, but those who lived it remember the weight in the air before the explosion. The tense waiting, the dread baked into every radio announcement, the knowledge that something enormous had shifted and no one could shift it back. That is why this chapter doesn't end with a bang. It ends with a realization settling over a continent. War had returned not as a surprise visitor, but as a consequence everyone had watched walking toward them for years. And in that realization, a final thought hangs like a low, steady bell. When a world spends too long hoping that the last warning is the last warning, it eventually wakes to a morning where warnings are gone, and only war remains to answer what hesitation allowed to grow. By the time the world woke to war in September 1939, it was tempting to look for a single switch that had been flipped, a single villain, a single mistake, a single moment when history could have gone the other way. But World War II doesn't behave like a simple story with one cause. It behaves like a long line of dominoes